Hey guys, this is Philosophossum, and this video is going to be a bit different from what I usually do. Ordinarily on this channel I talk about politics, philosophy, social issues, things like that. In this video I'm going to be doing something completely different. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I work in IT. Ever since I was a little kid I've been fascinated by computers, and I sort of knew growing up that this is a line of work I'd be interested in. Well, now I have a degree in computer science. I'm also A+, Network Plus, and Security Plus certified. And I've done everything from unjamming printers to installing network equipment to writing Java code. So when I heard Filthy Heretic and Esoteric Entity talking about programming languages on a stream the other day, this of course caught my attention. I told them that I think C++ is the best language, and their response to this wasn't so hot. At first they said I must have been trolling because in their opinion C++ is a horrible language. In their opinion C is a better language to learn. And I should preface this by saying that a lot of this quite frankly comes down to preference. You see, information technology is one of those fields where there tends to be a lot of pack mentality. You know, you have Team Intel versus Team AMD, Team NVIDIA versus Team Radeon, Team Windows versus Team Mac versus Team Linux, and even Team Linux is further subdivided into Team Debian, Team Ubuntu. Every tech nerd will have their favorite preference for something computer related, and they'll be ready to defend it religiously if you talk shit about it. Even something as simple as cooling fans or thermal paste, people will vehemently defend what they feel to be as the best brand. I'm just going to make this short video just to kind of explain why I feel that C++ is the best language. So this video is more or less going to be divided into two parts. In the first part I'm going to explain my case as to why it is I prefer C++ over other languages, specifically over C, since that's what Filthy Heretic recommends as an alternative. And in the second part of the video I'm going to specifically address the criticisms against C++ that Filthy Heretic brings up. So like I said before, I do have a degree in computer science, and back in college I did actually learn both C and C++. And both languages are pretty much similar in learning curve and syntax and basic functionality, but I personally prefer C++, and there's two reasons in particular. The first reason is that I like the syntax of C++ better. A lot of it seems more straightforward and intuitive than in C. For example, in C, the calls used to allocate or deallocate memory are malloc and calloc, respectively, whereas C++ uses the calls new and delete. In my opinion, this is more intuitive and straightforward. I mean, the terms new and delete are much more self-explanatory about what it is that they do, and are kind of easier to remember. Another example of this is the use of stream operators in C++. In the C language, in order to print something to the screen or to take input from the user, you had to use print and scan statements, which are kind of clunky and cumbersome. In C++, we use stream operators, which are not only more intuitive from a syntactical standpoint, as they use little arrows to show where the data is flowing, but you can also do things like have something print to the screen multiple times in the same line of code, inline conditionals, and you can do things like overload the stream operator, which can make it easier to print certain types of objects to the screen. Not only do I find the syntax more intuitive, but C++ also has a lot of features that C doesn't. For example, C++ supports exception handling, which basically enables it so that your program doesn't automatically crash just because it runs into an error. This can be a useful tool not just for crash proofing, but also for debugging. C++ also supports reference pointers, which makes it so that your program can directly operate on a value stored in memory, as opposed to operating on that value itself. The advantage to this is that since the program is directly operating on that value in memory, it doesn't have to waste memory or processor cycles to copy that value over, operate on it, then overwrite where it was originally in memory. Now of course for simpler programs, saving a little bit of memory space or processor time might not make much of a difference, but when you're writing a very large program, those little bits do add up. But I think the biggest selling point for C++ over C is that C++ supports object-oriented programming. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it basically enables you to create classes of objects that all share attributes in common. The biggest advantage of this is that it makes it much simpler to write complex programs. For simple programs like word processors or spreadsheet programs, things like that, you might be able to get around using OOP. But if you're making something really complex like a video game, even simple video games like Snake or Tetris you could probably do without OOP. But if it's a really complex video game like Civilization or Age of Empires, that would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to pull off without some form of OOP. And well, since C doesn't support OOP, you're kind of limited in the range of complexity you can accomplish. And since C++ does support OOP, it has a lot of the advantages that come with OOP, like inheritance, polymorphism, awesome. These are things that enable your program to accomplish more while writing less code. Like if you go on Indeed or LinkedIn and look up any video game development job, they'll typically prefer people with C++ experience over C experience, just because it's a more useful language. Now you can of course replicate a lot of the functionality of C++ in C. I'm sure there's a way of doing it, but it requires so much extra finagling it's probably not even worth it. So now I'm going to address Filthy's criticisms of C++, and there's primarily two of them. The first one has to do with the file size of the executable created after compiling. Filthy argues that since the same program compiled in C will produce a smaller executable file than the same program produced in C++, this means that C is more efficient. That's not necessarily the case, however. You see, since C++ has more features than C, compiled programs in C++ will typically contain more metadata. So the fact that a simple program written in C++ will compile to produce a larger executable file than C may not necessarily be due to inefficiency. It may come down to the fact that since C++ is primarily intended for more complex programs, simple programs can often get filled with unnecessary metadata. There are also quite a few other factors that determine the size of the executable file produced after compiling. It can be the IDE that you're using, it can be the optimization setting that your compiler uses. A compiler that's optimized for C++ can actually really slim down the executable. So if the same program produces different sized executable files in different languages, that could be for a multitude of reasons, not necessarily inefficiency. But definitely the most damning piece of evidence that Filthy Heretic presents against C++ comes from an article on a website called CatV, which goes into detail on an interview between IEEE Computer Magazine and Bjarne Strousup, who is the person responsible for developing C++. The article features a transcript of the interview, in which it can be seen that Strousup actually makes some very damning allegations. For example, Strousup admits that he wanted to make the program difficult to learn by intention, in order to artificially deflate the supply of competent programmers. Strousup claims that a lot of the extra functionality he added to the language wasn't necessarily there to expand its capabilities, but to make it more difficult to learn. He also alleges that he only promoted the language as a joke and wasn't actually intending for it to catch on. That's some pretty damning evidence right there, isn't it? The person who created the language admits that his intention was to make it artificially difficult, and that he only promoted it as a joke. I guess that's the death knell for C++, right? Well, not exactly. First thing you have to wonder is, well, are there any independent sources that can corroborate this conversation? I mean, the person who invented one of the most commonly used programming languages in the industry, coming out and admitting that he made it artificially difficult on purpose, is kind of a big deal. I mean, it would be like if Henry Ford said on the record that he made his cars artificially difficult to drive. It's not exactly a small thing, and you'd think something this major would be picked up by the media. Well, I did some digging around to see if I could find any other independent sources to try and corroborate what was said here, but I've largely come up empty-handed. For all I know, this entire conversation was fabricated, but even if we were to assume that this conversation did actually take place, I still don't feel like it's the major gotcha against C++ that Filthy Heretic makes it out to be. Even if it's true that C++ was designed to be artificially difficult or as a joke or whatever, well, so what? Just because something was designed as a joke or designed to be intentionally difficult doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be useful. As I've mentioned previously in this video, C++ has a multitude of features that makes it very useful, and a lot of people seem to agree since it's very widely used. I mean, if it's useful and functional and serving people's needs, who really cares what the intention was behind its design? Considering that we have high school classes that teach C++, you know, like teenagers are able to understand it, it's hard to say how well Strousup delivered on his intention there. What else is problematic about this conversation is that Strousup makes a lot of claims that he doesn't clarify or elaborate on. He claims that object-oriented programming is inefficient and that people never reuse code, but we never really get a detailed explanation on why he believes this. Strousup also tries to present flaws with the language that are really ultimately flaws with the user. He mentions the issue of confusion being caused by operator overloading, but this is really only a problem if you either overuse operator overloading or don't keep track of how you're using it. Most programmers in the industry know not to add unnecessary complexity and to thoroughly document how your program functions. Just following simple industry guidelines, these types of issues can be avoided. Like, I've used operator overloading in a bunch of my projects and never had any issues with it. The biggest thing I want to bring your attention to, though, is that this conversation allegedly happened over 2 decades ago. The thing you have to understand about technology is that it's very fluid. It's constantly changing, adapting, evolving. What was true about a certain technology 20 years ago, even 1 year ago, may not necessarily be true now. One of the key differences between C and C++ is that C++ has actually been updated numerous times since it was first released. So even if we were to just take for granted that C++ was this awful garbage language when it was first created, with the numerous amount of time the the industry has been using it and improving upon it in the interim that may not necessarily be the case today. C++ has been and continues to be my favorite programming language. Now, Filthy Heretic doesn't like C++. He thinks you should learn C instead, which is fine. He's allowed to have that opinion. I respect that. And the truth is, C isn't really a bad language to learn either. Even though it may not have the same features that C++ does, C actually has quite a few advantages of its own. As a matter of fact, you could argue that one of its advantages is its simplicity. Because C is so much simpler than C++, it may be useful for someone who just wants to write a simple program and doesn't want to get bogged down in all the bells and whistles. Another big advantage to C is that since the Unix platform is based on C, anyone who has a good understanding of the C language could be a systems administrator. But the main point I really want to get across here is that there really isn't such a thing as a better language. I mean, different languages have different features, capabilities, pros and cons. It really comes down to what your preferences are and what you're trying to accomplish. If you're writing a real complex program, you'll want C++. If you're writing more of a simple fundamental program but don't need all the bells and whistles, then C will do just fine. If you want a program to run on multiple platforms but don't really care how fast it is, then you want Java. If you want your program to run fast but don't really mind it being limited to certain platforms, then maybe something more metal like assembly is what you're looking for. Different languages just have different capabilities, different pros and cons, and it really just comes down to what it is you're looking to accomplish. Now, my biggest advice to anyone out there who wants to learn how to write programs, don't just learn one language. Try to learn several of them. Because like I said, different languages have different features, different capabilities, different learning curves. You may find that you're not exactly a fan of one language, but are getting the hang of another. Now, if you're new to programming and don't know anything about it whatsoever, a good entry-level language, in my opinion, is Java. The reason for that is because Java handles a lot of things for you in the background. Things like memory management, thread management, that's all sort of handled for you in Java. Because of that, I feel it makes it very approachable for people who are new to programming. Python and Ruby are also very beginner-friendly as well. If you're new starting out, I would avoid any sort of language that's very hardware, bare metal oriented, like assembly or basic. Those aren't particularly beginner-friendly. Also, antiquated languages like COBOL or Fortran. I would also hold off on those until you have a little more experience. But bottom line, C++ is my favorite language. That's the one I like. If you disagree with me, cool. You can go ahead and use whatever language you think is best. This is just my opinion.